Today we're going to talk about harmony, and rather than approaching harmony in the traditional way, that is, learn a bunch of rules that tell you what you shouldn't do, I'm going to take a slightly different approach. I'm going to teach you what you should do, and if you do these things, by consequence, you will not commit any part writing errors. For this video, we're going to start by only realizing root position chords. To realize root position chords, you really only need to memorize 3 rules. Now why is that? Well, there's really only 3 types of bass motion. We have movement by seconds, by thirds, and by fourths. Okay, wait. Aren't you missing movement by sevenths, sixths, and fifths? Not really, because if we think about this, a seventh is just a second inverted, a sixth is just a third inverted, and a fifth is a fourth inverted. The same exact rules apply to the inverted intervals. We're going to start with movement by a third or a sixth. When the bass moves by a third or sixth, we keep the 2 common tones, in this case E and G, which are shared between the 2 chords C major and E minor. We then move the remaining voice to the nearest chord tone. We'll apply the same principle to get back to our C major chord, keep our 2 common tones, and move the remaining voice to the nearest chord tone. Notice that the root, which is synonymous with the bass in this case, is doubled in all chords. For now, we will always be doubling the root in root position chords. For now. In the next video, I'll talk about when not to double the root in root position chords. So let's try one more example that contains a sixth and a third, so that you can see that this rule still works even when applied to the inverted intervals. Our first chord is A minor, which shares the 2 notes C and A with our next chord F major. These 2 notes stay put, and the remaining voice E moves to the nearest chord tone F. We repeat this procedure. We keep our 2 common tones F and A, and move the remaining voice to the nearest chord tone. Notice I'm not even checking for things like parallel fifths or octaves or anything like that. Because if you follow this rule, you won't end up with those errors, or any at all. Next we have movement by a fourth or fifth. When the bass moves by a fourth or fifth, we keep the 1 common tone, in this case G, and move the remaining voices to the nearest chord tones. In this case, E and C move to D and B respectively. We follow the exact same procedure to return to our C major chord, keep the single common tone, and move the remaining 2 voices to their nearest chord tones. Movement by a second is the simplest of them all in my opinion. All the upper voices will move in contrary motion with the bass to their nearest chord tones. And we follow the same exact procedure to return to our C major chord. All the upper voices move in contrary motion with the bass to their nearest chord tones. Now let's try and realize a full-blown exercise that utilizes every type of bass motion. I want to emphasize something. Whenever you do these exercises, you need to sing the bass. In fact, you need to sing every line you write. I highly recommend singing 1 line, say the soprano, while playing the remaining 3 voices. You should do this with all voices. If we're not actively trying to hear these things, then we're really not doing much more than solving a Sudoku puzzle. I can teach a scientist, a lawyer, a doctor, whatever, all the rules of part writing, and they could very well follow them perfectly, but that doesn't mean they'll actually know what they're doing. They'll be writing something without having any idea of how the thing they just wrote will sound. You won't reap the rewards that come from studying harmony if you don't actively try to internalize these things orally. So once you've sung the bass, analyze the intervallic content of the line. In this case, we begin with a leap up a fourth, we then move down a second, up a fourth, down a third, up a second, and down a fifth. Now we have to figure out what note to start with in the soprano. This is a very subtle thing that doesn't really get talked about too often. Do we start with C, G, or E? Does it make a difference? In order to know what soprano note we should be starting with, we have to know where we're going. Ultimately, pretty much every exercise, for now, should end with a perfect authentic cadence. That being said, we will inevitably have a C as our final soprano note, and that C will very likely be preceded by the leading tone B over the 5-chord G major. Just by knowing how we'll end this phrase, we can already rule out E as our starting note. I won't put the realization up with the starting note E, but just know that if we start with E and follow all the rules perfectly, we won't end on a perfect authentic cadence. I recommend you try it yourself anyhow so that you can practice applying the rules in general. You should actually try out all the possibilities when you're starting out, just so that you can build that experience and eventually start to get a feel for what note would be best to start with. Now we're left with G and C. Both of these will lead us to our perfect authentic cadence. So which one is correct? Is there even a correct one? I definitely think so. In general, our soprano line should be beautiful, melodic, interesting, and cohesive. To save time, I'll tell you that starting with C will not create a soprano line with the characteristics I just mentioned. If we start with C, our soprano will just oscillate between the notes C and B, which is super boring and stagnant, not what we're looking for. Again, I recommend you try it yourself anyhow. It's good to hear both the good and the bad, especially because oftentimes we aren't even really aware of what bad is. With that long-winded explanation, we're left with G. G is our best option. We begin with movement by a fourth, so we keep our common tone C and move our remaining two voices E and G to the nearest chord tones of the next chord, in this case F and A. Then we have movement by a second, so all we have to do is move all the upper voices in contrary motion with the bass to their nearest chord tones. E to A is another fourth, so we keep our common tone E and move the remaining two voices G and B to the nearest chord tones of the next chord, which are A and C. Our first and only instance of bass motion by a third is next. With motion by a third, we keep two common tones, A and C, and move the remaining voice E to the nearest chord tone, F. We have another second from F to G, so we move all the upper voices in contrary motion with the bass to their nearest chord tones. And finally, when we have a fifth, which is synonymous with motion by a fourth, we keep our common tone G and move the two remaining voices to their nearest chord tones. And there you have it, a perfectly realized example. Notice how the soprano line has a nice organic arc to it. It's quite melodic, at least the most melodic of all the options. We have this reiteration of tonic near the end, which is nice because by emphasizing tonic, the home note of the key, we're kind of signaling that we're going to be heading back home to wrap things up soon. Let's listen to just the soprano and the bass line. And now the whole thing. Thanks for watching. In our next harmony video, I'll cover the exceptions that come with realizing root position chords. We'll talk about when it will be appropriate to actually not follow these 3 rules. Thanks again, and be sure to subscribe and ring the bell to get a notification whenever I put a new video out. See you soon!